and welcome to a new episode of the Computomics podcast. Our guest today is Darryn Keiller, the founder and president of WayBeyond, a New Zealand agtech company focused on digital agronomy for protected cropping. Hi, Darryn.
Hi, Anna. Great to see you.
It's great to see you too. Darryn, I've been wondering, you travel so much. What's the last thing that inspired you while you were traveling?
Whenever I visit farmers, growers of crops, I'm always inspired because what they do is so hard. And I think as consumers, we're so removed from what's involved in producing, the food crops that we enjoy every day. When you go onto a farm, especially in really obscure parts of the world like Mexico or Morocco, it's just staggering what they manage to achieve despite all the challenges.
How often do you visit farms? How often do you get to go on site? Because I'm assuming you have to do a lot of the presidential kind of classic tasks as well.
Yeah, of course. I do some of that, where I might speak at a conference or be talking to, industry strategics in the industry about the direction of technology and how that could impact food production. But, I always try to fit in customer visits and also potential customer visits. So I always try to spend time on farms, just so I've always sort of got my finger on the pulse of what is going on, what are the present challenges that they're having, because they do change from year to year. One year it can be drought. So, water or the absence of water can be a real pressure. Or another season, it could be a biological problem, like often a disease outbreak, such as there was in the tomato industry with the brown rugose virus, and so, they're constantly being hit with new challenges, but they do change in terms of what their priority might be at that time. And so the only way you can really stay on top of that is to make sure you're communicating regularly with your customers and if possible, go on site and walk the farms with them.
To me, it makes even more sense with you because of why you founded the company. Can you tell us, as someone who's had a very varied background, commercially, entrepreneurial experience, what inspired you to found WayBeyond?
That's an excellent question. I never intended to go into agriculture. I was working with a number of different startups as an advisor after I'd left my corporate career in technology. And, I was across drone technology, nanotechnology, advanced materials science, all sorts of interesting things. And then I got an introduction to automation company called AutoGrow, and AutoGrow was working in the greenhouse industry. And it wasn't founded by me, but I ended up taking an investment in the company and then becoming its CEO in 2015, I think, or 2016. And that's how I got in. So I invested in 2014 and then got involved full time in 2016. And at that time, a lot of what we were focused on was more around what was happening in indoor vertical farming. They had become the big noise, that everybody was looking at, this idea of, soilless production, essentially in buildings under LED lights. And so that was kind of my entree into the industry. And the technology was very interesting. And this, again, a New Zealand company was competing with these Dutch giants like Priva and Hugendorn and Ridder Group. AutoGrow was just this tiny, company trying to do the same thing, but for smaller greenhouse operators. And so that was sort of how I got in. I got drawn in by that. And then WayBeyond, I incubated inside AutoGrow. And it was really the fact that I saw an opportunity to really leap the type of technologies that were being applied in the industry. Because agriculture was really backward. No matter where you looked around, the dominating technology for 120 years has been the tractor. And like everything about farming, whether it's corn, cows, or blueberries, the central feature of all the farms was some form of tractor. And that was really the technology. And every other technology was built around it. And that was sort of the way it was. And it was only in around 2012, 2013, when you started to get the arrival of cloud-based computing and software as a service. So when that sort of started to emerge, people don't remember, but, service providers like Google and AWS and Microsoft Azure, these things only became commercially available technologies for startups in around about 2012, 2013. It's not that long ago. And yet you wouldn't think so because of everything that's happened since then. But that was sort of how I got drawn in. So this idea of that we could solve these really gnarly problems with, food production in light of climate shifts and water scarcity and pest and disease outbreaks and apply data and artificial intelligence and software to solve those. That was what drew me in.
That's the perfect segue to ask. So what exactly do you do? How do you use that kind of data to help with the challenges that farmers face?
Sure. So, I mean, WayBeyond is the founder of digital agronomy. So basically what we created was digital agronomy for horticulture. And, we sort of put our stake in the ground in the industry globally that was what we were creating that didn't exist. So it was this idea of data-driven insight to essentially help make better decisions on the farm every day objectively through data rather than subjectively only through the experience of the grower, which of course varies hugely in terms of experience, but also in terms of capability. So having a long career in the industry doesn't make you the best grower. It can, but not by itself. Digital agronomy was sort of the encapsulation of all these different ideas that I had around how to employ data and artificial intelligence.
If you take us into basically the setup, you say data, but what does that actually mean? What are the sources for your data basically? So how do you collect the data from the farm and get it into the cloud?
And this is the challenge at the very beginning. So if you go back to 2014 in the greenhouse sector, and then later under WayBeyond, we went broader into what's called protected cropping, which is a much larger part of that ecosystem, where you're growing things under canopy and tunnels. Actually, a very, very old methodology that goes all the way back to Babylon. So, the idea of growing crops in a shaded environment was ancient and sort of almost rediscovered after the Second World War. But there's no data, really. So it's like, first of all, we had to figure out how to collect it. So, and what sort of data was it? Well, it needed to be environmental. So you needed environmental data, and you also needed, data in terms of what was happening to the physiological response of the plant. So essentially, was the plant, feeling the effects of temperature? Was it feeling the effects of light, which drives photosynthesis in the plant, and other factors that drive, say, how do I put this best biologically, the life of the plant over its cycle, and you being able to see and track what was happening with the condition of the plant over that time, and essentially what level of stress was the plant under. So essentially, how could you define and measure a stress response in the plant because of it being too hot or too cold or too much light or not enough, or being hydrated or not hydrated enough. And so having to look at all those sort of vectors, as it were. And again, nobody had ever done it. So the fact is that, we had to figure out what was the best way and most scalable way. So we started off by developing a sensor product. And so we had not intended to be a hardware business.
That's how it always works best. If you don't intend to, but then you have to because of
right.
need.
And there was a fundamental problem, is that there was no way to capture the data at that time unless you developed a product that would do it. And so we created Folium, and Folium is what we deploy onto farms at scale and allows us to capture principally environmental, but also some plant response data as well. And then over time, because we've built an open platform, we've integrated data from other sources. So we've taken data from the customers, like pest and disease tracking information, and more recently, satellite data. So the really big game changer in the industry has been the proliferation of satellite constellations. So this has really been driven by SpaceX in the main, and allowed a lot of new providers to put up much smaller, low-cost satellite constellations that are focused on tracking what's happening in soil and what is happening environmentally, and they can provide insights into farm performance remotely. We have Farm Road, which is our platform, basically draws in from all these sources. And so, but that has taken, almost a decade to be able to do that. And there are very few platform providers, ag tech providers in the industry who have been able to accrue the volume of data that we have and the diversity of data types that we have. So that's kind of the beginning.
I was going to say 10 years, and then you have this mix also of like the real-time data, the long-term kind of development data.
You had all sorts of other challenges. So you had the fact that farmers were reluctant to provide data. So basically, think of it as a cultural challenge in the industry. There was a period around 2015, 2016, and it was driven by row crop farmers, so corn farmers, soy farmers, wheat farmers in the US, where some of the emergent ag tech technologies that did exist were gathering and tracking data, and the farmers suddenly took the view of saying, well, hang on a minute, this is our data. Why are we giving it?
And what are you going to do with it?
Why are we giving it to you for free? And then what are you going to do with it? And then you're going to charge us for insights in our own data. And so there was this big sort of furore over it at the time.
How did you overcome that?
Well, I remember I spent years just having to meet with CEOs of major farming operations and explain to them about how their data was secure, that they would always retain ownership of it. So we developed a very open data policy, and that policy is still on our website. That's how we operate with the industry. There are opportunities to monetize the data for the farmers, but nobody's done that yet.
I was going to ask, because that sounds like also, if I imagine for someone who's just kind of overcome this trust issue, then to think of this that's a totally new business basically as well, right?
And that's the thing, you could do a startup that only focused on that, and this is one of the things. As I kind of got into agriculture, it was just like an ocean. It was like, you could drown in it as a founder, because you sort of, with every turn of the corner, you open up another huge area of potential, but you've got limited resources because you're a startup, so you can't solve all of those things. And I believe, my position today, and I've been around for 11 years, which makes me one of the longest serving founders in the whole industry at this point, who's still around, right? Because a lot of companies aren't here anymore. It's come a long way, and technologies have advanced a lot further. But there's still, the laggard is actually the customer. The customer market itself is still very slow. So while you do get farm operators who are more future focused and more embracing of innovation, there are the companies that almost all of us who do ag tech kind of get as our initial early adopters, with spurs on great confidence that we're doing the right thing. But there's a point where you run out of those guys, and then now you need broader industry adoption in order to get commercial scale. And that's, again, remain, the problem with the whole industry is that nobody has. So the fact is that when you go and, talk to or look at all the ag tech companies, you'll see amazing announcements, we just raised 100 million, we're now worth $1 billion and all this stuff, But the fact is when you look into the actual scale of the business in terms of customers and revenue, they're not that big. And the promise is still there, but it's the fact that, the industry is still reluctant to pay for the value that comes from the investment that's gone into all these new technologies.
Let's actually go a little deeper on that, because it's part of what we do here is really to try and show what is the value of using a technology like that. What are the kind of insights that your customers can draw from your data?
It's enormous what they can do. Practically, we focus on seed to farm gate. So basically, we're looking at everything from their choice of genetics. So we track a particular, say, variety of blueberry, all the way through to when it's harvested. We can explain, why one part of the farm is performing better than another part of the farm. We can help the grower understand why one season is better than another season, which will help them with the season that's coming up. Or we can help them on a daily basis with, the fact that, say, there was a frost overnight, and what is the likely impact of that, and therefore from an agronomy standpoint, what decisions should they make, that day because of what's occurred and anticipation of what may occur. And so that would then lead them to say, okay, well, we need to lift the canopy up to allow more air to circulate, or we need to whitewash the plastics because we're expecting higher UV radiation, right? All these types of things.
So basically you give, based on the historical data you have and the real-time data and analysis, you can kind of model outcomes and give...
With historical data, so we have our head of artificial intelligence in Patisi. He's developed so many models for so many different things, ranging from pest disease to environmental issues. And we use a combination of both historical and real-time data for that. And sometimes we just use real-time data. So one of the things we've tried to move to is actually just, wherever possible, focus on real-time data rather than a historical. Historical has turned out to be very difficult to get from growers, and it's easier just to develop more sophisticated models that don't need it. And the saving grace of it is actually, again, being satellite data. So the fact that we can now get more ready access to particularly environmental data through satellite aggregation of satellite data, and there are service providers who do that now. We draw from that through an API, and that informs our data models, and those data models are predictive in nature. And then we can say to the grower, this is going to happen in 3 days, and this is what you need to be doing about it, right? And so that's the agronomy. And that's why the user audience for Farm Road is agronomists, head growers, heads of irrigation, heads of pest and disease practice, basically the people on the farm who are the educated knowledge worker. And the knowledge worker is our user, as opposed to, say, everybody on the farm. Everybody on the farm is not a user of our service. It's the knowledge-based workers, which, can take that insight and then taken action from it. And so that's the value. And what it does is it means they're not guessing, right? So, I go back to that earlier comment I made around knowledge. I remember in the early days speaking to a CEO of a big farm operation in the US, and he said the difference between a grower of 20 years experience and 10 years experience is about a 25% difference in yield. I know, it's staggering, right? So the fact that this person has just been around longer and seen more seasons and had to confront and address more problems makes them more knowledgeable. And so they're more likely to know what to do. But a lot of them at this point, by the way, are retiring out of the industry because they're all in their 60s, and then all the the young people that are coming through don't want to use all these old school methods of having to learn by doing for 20 years, right? They're like, well, where's my app? And
well, also, I would
solve this
say the
problem.
question is if they even can. Would they even be able to, because of the way, the more extreme kind of shifts we get because of climate change and everything? Can you even, would it even be possible to learn fast enough over this, let it be a decade, 2 decades, like you just said, to gain that experience?
Well, that's an excellent
to be able to apply
provocation,
it?
because I would say no, probably not. And talk about computomics for a moment. That's something that computomics has done quite well. There's a lot of formative work around, being able to be predictive on environmental change and being able to target geographies for that. So again, people who are making big decisions around, their farm assets and, whether they should still be where they're located, but rather move somewhere else, or in anticipation of some environmental shift, they change, the genetics that they use and they match it, so that when that change comes, they've already made the change they need to make. I mean, this wasn't possible before. All these types of concepts are relatively new, like only in the last decade. And in terms of being able to prove that they work, I would say only the last 5 years. So again, very nascent.
That's why it's fascinating, because I guess it is, people do want to see the proof, and people in ag tech and farmers, especially traditionalists, I think it's very much, like you said, a traditional business, a business that has for a very long time worked with just a tractor and everything surrounding it. To have the proof of concept and tell them, listen, it is worth the investment. It is worth trying to increase your knowledge game using this new technology, because it can actually, we have the proof of concept. It will save you time. It will increase your yield by so and so much. I'm assuming these kind of talks is what you have to do, because you said it's still a challenge sometimes to convince people.
It is. And I mean, and you can sit down and talk about improving yield, or more particularly improving the quality of the yield, because improving quality is arguably more important for most growers because they get paid more for higher grade fruit, right? So if they get a grade A or grade 1 fruit, they'll generally get paid 4 times more than what they get for a second grade fruit. Yeah. So the economics of it, the economics of it's quite shocking. So, because that top grade fruit will find its way to a premium retailer, So if you're going to go into supermarket, whether that's in Germany, the Netherlands, or New Zealand, doesn't really matter where, and you go to a premium stockist, they're going to be charging you a pretty serious amount of money for 125 gram or 250 gram, we will call it a punnet, but basically a box of fruit. And often those prices are eye-watering and a premium outlet, but that's a grade 1 fruit. And from that, the grower and the retailer are both making a lot of money. But if it becomes a grade 2 fruit, then that will go to a more volume supermarket provider at a much lower price, or even be in a white labeled or private label product. And then if you're a grade 3 product, I mean, that ends up as the frozen berries that you get in your yogurt or the smoothie. It's like everything has where it ends up, but for the grower, what makes it economically viable for them is that they get as much high grade fruit as they can, and also enough volume, yield relative to their scale of production. And so that's quite a lot for them to juggle, even just at that level, just trying to figure that out.
Given that, maybe as a final question, if you take a bit of an outlook, kind of the next 5 to 10 years, where do you see, potential avenues for increasing that kind of development, or that also we started with culture change, that to keep going with that culture change, to make people see that and hopefully adopt it?
What I think I'm seeing at the moment is a return of the industry to more seriously evaluating these new sciences and technologies. At the time, there was kind of a flurry of interest after the pandemic eased, and then it died down again, because of all the geopolitical issues that we're all still confronting. But the industry is realizing they can't put all this on hold, just because of wars and geopolitical conflicts that have been, that are likely to continue. They can't put off having to address changes that have got to be made in the way we manage our soils, the way we produce our crops, the way we supply food products. And so I think there's a sort of another cycle coming around of interest in ag and biotech, food tech, but a much more critical eye on it. So it won't be a hype cycle like it was before, where you get overblown valuations for startups and ridiculous promises made about what they can do. I hope there's going to be a little bit more sanity to it. And what I'd be encouraging growers and farm operators to consider is that they need to keep an open mind, number one, because, a lot of them got very sort of jaundiced about emerging technologies because of what happened in the 90s and the early 2000s, when there was another wave of technology hype and a lot of that stuff just didn't work. And so they became very cynical. And they also found it threatening because a lot of people in the industry thought that these, just like the conversation about AI at the moment, that it will replace their jobs. But it won't. I mean, the reality is that there's not nearly enough people in agriculture anyway. So the fact is we have a shortage of knowledgeable people in farming and agriculture at a time when we need more. The gap can be filled by really smart software and data and artificial intelligence and cool technology. It can. And the maturity of what is available is much greater than what it was 15 years ago. I mean, technology has just moved so far. I mean, if you think about everything that's happened in 15 years, the proliferation of electric vehicles, the shift to more electrified systems through battery technology, the leaps that have been made in genetics alone, there's just been all these leaps that have been made. And that means the potential of what can be done is far greater. And really they have to get on the train. So the fact is they should stop trying to resist it and they should get on board with it and start collaborating with founders and companies and trying to make it work. Because they're only going to do better out of it if they do. That's my belief.
And I think that's the perfect way to close this wonderful, deep, wide-ranging conversation, Darryn. Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Thank you for listening in today. Want to learn more? Then check out our show notes and more info on computomics.com. If you have questions or want to propose a next guest, please reach out to us at podcast@computomics.com.